transmitted by the Internet Society to its members and everybody else who joins through them rather than through us directly. They, however, are not cannot be seen on the video. And so let me kind of just say something about David and then introduce the topic slightly. David is an economics PhD from the University of Rochester, noted in particular noteworthy this week by the Nobel Prize in Economics that went to one of its graduates, Richard Thaler. I don't know if you guys intersected David, but certainly a good number of distinguished people have come from that program, David being one of them. He has also been had his education from Washington University, and he is currently teaches auction design strategy implementation at the Toulouse School of Economics, kind of a great institution for economics research in France. David has been noted in particular as an expert on auctions and game theory. He has advised governments on auction designs, including the FCC, the Canadian government, the Australian governments for their spectrum auctions. He's also been a leading advisor and helped guide bid strategy teams for auctions in the United States, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Mexico, in India, in Brazil. I'm not sure, I'm probably just scratching the surface. Where there's an auction, there's David. And previously, he was also involved in energy auctions in a variety of ways. So David is kind of one of that distinguished and very small tribe of auction experts. And that is a increasingly specialized field because it becomes increasingly complicated. And that is not coincidental. So at the beginning of this conference, which will deal with a particular very complex auction that the FCC has held just now, it is perhaps worthwhile kind of speculating why it has become so complex. This particular auction took approximately 4 years to design. The bidding process itself lasted for exactly 1 year, and I think 1 year and 1 day. And it will take actually the implementation to take 39 months or so, but that's of course if everything works right, which it never does. And so the question is, why are these things kind of from the first moment of just starting to design it, never mind the decision process, to the actual implementation taking so incredibly long? It's an era where Moore's law, accelerated speed governs the IT sector, where 4G and 5G and these generations succeed each other relatively steady pace, where applications are exploding and mobile usage and internet usage online are exploding. And yet there is this incredibly slow pace of change. And that even is an improvement over what existed before. This is where David and I, frankly, part company, because while he is a kind of distinguished author and proponent of making auctions ever more efficient and ever more complex and ever more encompassing various policy goals, I have my skepticism for many years about the entire exercise. I think that the auctions are a good, possibly temporary solution coming out of the analog world. At a certain point, auctions were, in let's say, a heresy, I suppose. Sorry for the auctions were heresy, and auction theorists and people involved still go on and on about kind of the humiliations that some economists endured. Ronald Coase coming up with the idea, or rather his graduate student really coming up with the idea of the spectrum auction, and the kind of the way in which that was dismissed, but then eventually picked up. And that's supposed to be kind of like the end of history, right? Now we have auctions. Now all we have to do is to make them a little better, as if this is the end of history. When in fact, auctions still have the same problem coming from the analog world of giving exclusivity. The only difference is that it gives the exclusivity by way of a bidding process rather than by way of an administrative process. And that seems to be a kind of a huge difference, but in my mind, it really is not that big a difference. It's still a license exclusivity, whereas in fact, the digital technology enables us now to have much more of sharing mechanisms, of unlicensed spectrum mechanisms, of auction mechanisms, of simultaneity in usage and pricing based on congestion of the moment. But that's kind of in a way where things will be going. And the auction people can kind of stand on it and make the auctions better and better and better and better, and slower and slower and slower and slower. But the reality is this is just a temporary thing. And as far as I'm concerned, we should think about the future, not about how to rearrange the deck chairs here. But at this point, we are, of course, not quite there yet. The political process loves auctions because they are a big revenue makers. And this is one thing where liberals and conservatives agree on. First, the liberals like to have the revenue source as well as making business pay. Conservatives at the same time kind of like the idea of bringing in some market mechanisms. So everybody's agreed, and of course everybody likes to have the budget money given out. But I think that the fundamental problems are the exclusivity. The fundamental problems are also that it is revenue driven, and that it rewards, in fact, encourages and incents oligopolies because of the winner's curse in auctions, which inevitably therefore lead to people to overbid, and therefore or rather to bid in anticipation of maintaining prices that would be higher than there would be otherwise, and therefore they can bid higher, and therefore those with the intent to create an oligopoly will be the winners of the auctions. And those things are totally inevitable. So there are better mechanisms, such as those of instead of selling people exclusivity, kind of having usage fees, so that everybody can go in, but have to pay the going price, just like on a highway. Toll roads with congestion fees, that is where the toll gates are charging different prices depending on congestion conditions. All this will happen, but it will take a while to percolate into the system. Meanwhile, however, we're trying to make the auctions better and better. And now let's kind of discuss under David's leadership, for which we thank him, how this particular auction tried to make things better, and in fact whether it has succeeded, and what the lessons are for the United States and for other countries, and for auction theorists of what has happened in the United States. So, David, you can take it.
Okay, well, thanks, Ellie. I think my thinking's evolved since we last spoke, but you'll have to wait a little bit to hear me talk, because I want to get John on first. And one of the issues is I wanted to make sure we address was sort of how well did the FCC achieve its main policy goals, or what presumably should be its main policy goals. And as I understood it, they were to sort of achieve, promote the availability of affordable advanced telecommunication services, and not to result in increased concentration. So the first paper by John will John Peha, will discuss that. And I guess you were formerly CTO at the FCC, right, John? And and then Greg Rosston, who also spent time at the FCC, who advised T-Mobile, will talk about alternative auction methods might have worked better. And I have recent research on what should be the real target. And then Jose Cepeda, FTI, will talk about the reverse side. So, John, why don't you go ahead? John?
Since I unfortunately will not be here till the very end because I will be teaching classes when you wrap this up, I will respond very briefly to Ellie that while I absolutely agree that spectrum sharing is very not only useful, not only important, but I do not see how we can possibly meet the needs that we see coming in wireless systems without greatly expanding use of spectrum sharing. That doesn't mean we don't have licenses too, whether they are licenses for exclusive rights or licenses for primary rights. So there is still value there. You don't have to choose one or the other. I'll also throw out one more thing before I get into the topic that is listed here. I've been principally asked to talk about some issues of competition and spectrum management that will matter for auctions. I'm not speaking specifically about this auction. But one thing also to think about in this auction is that television technology is changing. That there's a new thing called ATSC 3.0 or next generation television that allows much more efficient use of spectrum than was ever possible before. We can replace these single transmitters with lots of transmitters, something called a single frequency network, which means one thing we might ask is whether we either had this incentive auction too soon or whether we need to have another one when this new technology is ready, which I'd love to talk about more. But instead, I'm going to talk about another topic that I like a lot. I'm going to talk about cellular economies of scale given recent changes in technology, and also why disparities in spectrum holdings are detrimental as a result.
That's wrong deck.
That's not my slide.
Jason?
Yeah, they're right there, Ellie.
How do I go to my slide 2?
The arrow next to the number 01.
The arrows are taking me to somebody else's slide. Let's see.
You're probably going the side arrow rather than the down arrow. Inside the box,
I've tried both.
John, go ahead. I've already advanced the slides. Go ahead.
Okay.
Just let me know when you want me to advance the next slide.
Okay, thank you. All right, so background. So I would argue that smartphones and tablets have fundamentally changed the engineering economics of cellular infrastructure. Cellular's been around a long time, but smartphones have put us in a different world. That because of smartphones and tablets generate so much traffic, they make things fundamentally different. And this is, the iPhone came out just a decade ago. So we're talking about a fairly recent phenomenon. In recent years, we've seen mobile network operators that want to keep up with their customers' usage have to double their capacity every 20 months, not to generate more revenue, just to hold on to what they have. So, and if MNOs, mobile network operators that can't expand that quickly are going to tend to lose market share to their competitors. And that means that capacity expansion in the last decade is a major cost for all mobile network operators. And that is going to change both the MNO strategy and it's got to change regulatory strategy. So we're going to look at both of those. Next, please. So I'll briefly tell you where I'm going, and then I'm going to give the talk to see how we got there. I'm experimenting with a new format here. So in the age of the smartphone, in the age where where usage per subscriber is doubling every year or two, the following is true. MNOs minimize their cost by growing both their spectrum and their tower holdings together at similar rates. And you don't just do one or the other. And with this strategy, there are very large economies of scale involved in increasing your capacity. And I believe those economies of scale may help to explain why we've seen consolidation of the cellular market in a number of countries. In this country, you know, the U.S., the AT&T T-Mobile merger, and maybe someday the T-Mobile Sprint merger attempts. So because of this economies of scale, when regulators divide spectrum, there is a trade-off. They would like cost effectiveness, they would like lots of competition, and those things are at odds. But regardless of number of mobile network operators you have, and there's a big fight, should there be 3, should there be 4, should there be some other number, it turns out that it is Pareto optimal to divide spectrum fairly evenly among all of your cellular carriers. And spectrum caps happens to be one effective way to do it. Not the only way to do it, but one effective way to do it within market mechanisms. And finally, there are reasons to want your spectrum policy and your antitrust policy to be aligned. So now I'm going to see if I can convince you that these things are true. Next, please. So outline of what's to come. I'm going to describe the analytic model. Then I'm going to talk about what it means for spectrum strategies to meet mobile network operator objectives. Then spectrum strategies to meet policymaker objectives, and finally our implications for spectrum policy going forward. Next, please. So my model, basic assumptions. First of all, I'm going to assume that mobile network operators do not hoard spectrum for foreclosure value, that is to keep spectrum away from their competitors. Especially important because many people propose spectrum caps precisely to deal with this kind of hoarding. I'm just going to assume it doesn't happen. Second, in general, a cellular carrier can increase its capacity in 3 ways. It can build more towers, it can obtain more spectrum, or it can upgrade its technology or some combination. In this work, I'm going to assume that all my mobile network operators have the similar technology. Obviously, in any given year, that's not true, but you know they upgrade at different times. But if you're thinking over the long run, that should be true. Second, I'm going to assume that each mobile network operator has acquired the spectrum holdings and the tower holdings that minimize cost for their current capacity. Again, there are times when that's not true, perhaps because you know a mobile network operator's assets were formed in a merger or some other odd accident of history, or perhaps because you expand your spectrum a whole lot in 1 year and then don't for a while, and then your towers a whole lot in another year and then don't for a while. But again, over time, I would expect this to roughly be true. And finally, I'm going to assume that market share is roughly proportional to capacity. That is, if my network carries twice as many bits as yours, I probably make twice as much money as you do. And I'm only going to consider capacity limited regions. From a cellular perspective, the world is divided up into coverage limited areas where I've got capacity to burn. I've just got to figure out how to get coverage everywhere. The places where I don't have capacity to burn and I've got to keep expanding capacity, those are the ones I'm worried about here. When I talk about number of towers, I mean number of towers in those regions. Oh, and one other, well, let's see. Yeah, good. Next, please. Some of my cost and capacity assumptions. I'm going to assume, typical as in a standard model, capacity increases linearly with spectrum. Actually, with the latest technology, you can get capacity to increase slightly faster than spectrum. So this is a slightly pessimistic assumption, but it's not a bad first order estimate. I'm also going to assume that capacity increases linearly with towers per square kilometer, which it does up to a point. You can reach a density at which that doesn't quite work so well, but in the area we care, it's a pretty good first assumption, first order assumption. I'm going to assume that cost per megahertz of spectrum is pretty much the same for everybody, that nobody can get it cheaper, and it's the same for all, you know, whether I buy 1 megahertz or 50. And I'm going to assume that cost per tower has three components that are also the same for everybody. There is a cost per tower, flat cost per tower. There is a cost per tower that is proportional to bandwidth. And there is a cost per tower that is proportional to data rate. And different components in that tower have different aspects of these. One other basic assumption I should be on my slide is I'm going to assume everybody has pretty much the same mix of high and low frequencies in there, and so I only have to worry about bandwidth. That's actually really important if we're talking about the incentive auction, because in that case, some of the competitors had much better access to low frequencies than others, and that played a factor. But over the longer term, I'll assume that that's not a factor, and it's just the bandwidth that they care about. Next slide, please. So if you would like to see all of the math to translate from that set of assumptions to a whole lot of results, I'm happy to share with anybody. There are papers out there. I'm not going to have any math in this talk. I just want to tell you what we learned. And first, I want to tell you what we learned about the mobile network operator strategy from a profit maximization perspective. So one thing we see with this engineering economic model is that when a mobile network operator has more spectrum, it can increase its capacity a lot more with each tower it adds, because that tower gets to use all of its spectrum. Similarly, when an MNO has more towers, every megahertz of spectrum brings more capacity, because that every megahertz of spectrum is used by all those towers. You put those things together, it means that you have, that is the basis of a large economy of scale when expanding capacity is a big fraction of your costs. It means that if I have both more towers and more spectrum, I get to add more capacity much more cheaply than my competitors. And in fact, I'm probably going to have both more towers and more spectrum, because the way you minimize cost for a given capacity is to grow your towers and grow your spectrum together. I would like the number of towers to be proportional to the amount of spectrum that I hold in bandwidth. And it'd be foolish to have lots of spectrum and few towers, or lots of spectrum, or lots of towers and little spectrum. And if you're following that kind of strategy, that means capacity actually increases according to spectrum squared, and not just linearly with spectrum. So that also means that, if I'm big, if I have lots of towers and lots of spectrum, it means I will gain more revenue for every megahertz of spectrum I add. It means I'm going to bid more for it in auction, and the big are going to get bigger, or at least the big have an advantage to get bigger. And it's going to be harder for mobile network operators with small amount holdings in both spectrum and towers to keep up. Next slide, please. So that was all from the perspective of a single cellular carrier. Now, if I think about this from a policy perspective, I have a conflict. I have two objectives. On the one hand, I would like mobile network operators to be cost effective. I'd like them to be able to serve lots of customers at low cost, and hopefully pass those low costs on to consumers. And if I want that, I would like to have a smaller number of large MNOs. On the other hand, I'd like to have lots of competition to give them incentive to pass those to lower prices and improve service. And for that, I might want a large number of small MNOs. So I have some decisions to make. But it turns out, while much of the world fights, is 4 MNOs the right number? Is it 3? Is it 5? Regardless of the number, I would clearly like to have a strategy that is a spectrum policy strategy that is Pareto optimal with respect to both of my goals. That is, I don't want it to be possible to make one goal better without making the other one worse. That's a minimum requirement for a good strategy. So I can now look quantitatively at what strategy does that. And to do that, I need quantitative measures. So my quantitative measure of cost effectiveness is total capacity of all MNOs divided by total cost of all MNOs. And my measure of competition is the traditional HHI. Next slide, please. Okay, and again, skipping lots of math, but available for anyone who wants to see it. If in any Pareto optimal division will have the following characteristics. Spectrum will be divided fairly evenly among the N mobile network operators for whatever N is. And by fairly evenly, I mean this. N minus one of them will have the same amount of spectrum, and the nth will have basically whatever is left, which is less than or equal to the first N minus one. And that's true whether N is small. That is the Pareto optimal allocation with these assumptions. And if you end up with large disparities among those N minus one, what that means is you could have, better spectrum policy could improve both, or better division of spectrum could improve both competition and cost effectiveness. And one way that actually does get you to these results is a spectrum cap that says you can hold a maximum amount of spectrum. You decide which spectrum, but everyone can hold a maximum amount of spectrum. Next slide, please. So then this creates an interesting conflict potentially between spectrum policy and antitrust policy. In some countries, antitrust policy has made sure that there are at least 4 major mobile network operators. For example, AT&T T-Mobile merger was not allowed because presumably we wanted more mobile network operators in the US at that time. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, O2 and 3 were not allowed to merge. And Ofcom said at the time, quote, they believe that the existence of at least 4 credible MNOs is important for the UK mobile market. However, this year we also saw Ofcom propose a spectrum cap of 42%. That is, one mobile network operator can get up to 42% of the spectrum that has been allocated for cellular use. They've since dropped it to 37%, but I'd argue certainly 42% and even 37% is pretty high if your goal is to have 4 credible mobile network operators. I'll argue whether that's the right goal or not, but those things seem out of sync. Next slide, please. And if they are out of sync, what you can end up with is forcing the market to have 4 mobile network operators, but not making sure that all 4 of them have access to enough spectrum, which means inferior competition, as you might expect with 3 MNOs, and less cost effectiveness, as you might expect with 4, sort of the worst of both worlds. Next slide, please. So let me come back to my findings before I talk about the future. As I've shown, mobile network operators minimize cost by growing both their spectrum and their tower holdings together. And with this strategy, you end up with large economies of scale. The larger providers can provide whatever capacity at lower cost than their smaller rivals. And that may explain why in recent years we've seen smaller MNOs trying to merge with each other or with the large ones. And so in response, when regulators divide spectrum, there is this trade-off between cost effectiveness and competition. But however you decide to balance those goals, the Pareto optimal result is to divide spectrum fairly evenly, and spectrum caps do achieve that. And we've also now seen the problem when spectrum caps and antitrust policy are not well aligned. All right. All of this is true in what I call the age of the smartphone, by which I mean 2 things. Actually, next slide, please. So let me say that was an analysis with engineering economic models that I think have been true for the last 7-8 years. Are they going to be true forever? Well, for one thing, this depends on the idea that data volume per user increases rapidly over time. Certainly something we've seen for the last 8 years. At the moment, I don't see it letting up. We've seen new smartphones come out with even higher resolution screens, which means users are probably going to want high resolution video and images, or at least the smartphone makers think so. So I don't see this letting up at the moment, but it could let up eventually, don't know. Perhaps a more interesting possible change on the horizon is that this assumes that spectrum allocated to cellular is increasing slowly. And we know that there is talk of using very high frequencies, the spectrum frontiers, in new ways that could change this. But again, I don't see it changing in the near term. It is something we're going to have to watch in the long term that could lead to new engineering economics. Next slide. And for anyone who hasn't had all that they can possibly stand by listening to me talk, the details are in this paper, Telecom Policy.
David, this is Ellie.
Yeah, hi.
Can we ask questions now,
Yeah.
or how do you want to?
We have a few minutes for questions, and John will have to go in a little bit. So, are there any questions?
Let me just start the first question to break the ice and invite people to follow up with questions that David will recognize. John, your model assumes that the towers are and the economies of scale and so on are connected to the company itself with its spectrum. But suppose you unbundle the two and you have tower companies that have their own economies and MNOs that have theirs, and the two might not be the same.
Well, yeah, good question.
How would that affect your model?
So I assume that there are costs per tower. That is true whether you build your own towers or whether you lease space on a tower company. If I build my own, I have big upfront costs and lower annual costs thereafter. If I lease space on somebody else, I have no upfront costs or small upfront costs, and then larger annual costs. But either way, I do have cost per towers. The key assumption there is that the cost for, that third party tower company charges everybody the same. That all towers are charged the same. They don't charge differently because they like AT&T, or differently because there's more usage of that tower. I could imagine complications in the model, but I think the core idea would still work. And certainly if Crown Castle or Fiber Tower charge you a flat rate for all of their towers equally to all of the providers, then the model is exactly right.
Thank you.
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Yes, is it possible to ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
This is Cass Kalba at Kalba International, and I had a lot of trouble with a lot of the assumptions, but I think the one that really ties it most together is the assumption that spectrum and towers have to go together. There's some kind of innate balance there. I think of spectrum prices. I work a lot around the world. They vary about 100 to 1 on a megahertz per pop basis. Maybe in the U.S. over the last 10 years or so, they varied more at the scale of 10 to 1. And I think of tower prices, including siting and all kinds of other factors, which in some places include extensive security costs, backup diesel generators, and so forth, also vary quite a lot per site. They may not vary as much in the U.S. environment, but I think as we move into advanced 4G and 5G, where we're going to need a much larger base of towers, and there's going to be potentially a scarcity of towers, the assumptions about how steady these costs are for everyone and compared to spectrum, and that everyone's going to pay the same leasing, for example, when a utility may claim monopoly powers to the poles, which could become very important in the future environment. There are already movements afoot to gain rights to utility poles and so forth, that these kind of assumptions that it's all a nice, neat balance between spectrum and towers, that spectrum is kind of within a narrow range, towers are within a narrow range, that they all fit nicely together, and that you've got to move on both fronts equally, I find, maybe a very adequate static assumption for particular purposes, but it's not a very dynamic one, and I think we could see some very big changes in the mix and balance and types of spectrum and towers that we're going to be dealing with, and different operators may have quite different combinations of approaches. So I just wonder if you see any of that happening, or if you really think this approach is going to kind of hold firm for quite a while and across a variety of situations.
So you said a lot of stuff. So let me at least 3 points. Thank you for the input. So I mean, certainly the world is messier than any model. The first point, first of all, I do not assume that spectrum and towers will be increased together, or that they will be proportional. That is not an assumption. That is a result. In other words, that says you don't have to do it that way, but if you do it that way, you will be able to provide a certain capacity at lower cost, which means, in a sense, if you have a choice, there are all sorts of strange anomalies in terms of history, but if you are growing your capacity steadily, this is the most cost-effective way to grow your strategy, or to grow your capacity. That, I believe, holds if the other true assumptions, which I'll get to in a minute, are true. And then you talked about both spectrum costs and tower costs. So spectrum costs, yes, certainly they vary tremendously from country to country, but that doesn't really matter. What does matter is that they do not vary from cellular carrier to cellular carrier. That AT&T cannot get spectrum at a lower cost than T-Mobile is an assumption. Maybe that's not always true, but if they're getting it in an open auction, it is true. It is also if spectrum is increasing or decreasing price in a predictable way, that could also affect my model. If it's randomly jumping around, it won't. But if we all know that the costs will go up over time or will go down over time, that may change how the optimal strategy works. Recent years, it doesn't look very steady. But again, I'm really assuming that all carriers can get a spectrum at the same price as each other, and that none of them at least knows that the price of spectrum will go up or down. It's not predictable. As for towers, yep, I mean, we've done work here too. It is certainly true that towers in urban areas do not cost the same as towers in rural areas. Although I would argue still that the cost for an AT&T tower is probably the same as the cost for a T-Mobile tower. If that's true, the ratio of towers to spectrum might be different in rural areas versus urban areas. But I'll still want to pick a ratio that makes sense and try to grow them together. I won't only grow my capacity in spectrum or only grow my capacity in towers. That's just technically possible, but is just not a cost-effective strategy. If there's one more quick question, I could do that, and then I need to run to class.
So I'm not sure. I raised my hand, but I'm not sure if I'm on.
Yeah, there are two questions, one from Joe Plotkin and one from Henning Schulzring. Henning?
Okay, no, okay.
So last quick question, please.
Okay, let me, since there seems to be radio silence, otherwise let me quick ask, if I take your simplified model, you would essentially reach for spectrum prices kind of an equilibrium price in the sense that it would be roughly equivalent to expanding capacity by adding towers, leaving spectrum alone, meaning that as a perception, at least, a forward-looking tower capacity increases, changes, the valuation of spectrum and willingness to bid would change, because the spectrum gets artificially expensive, even though I would love to have both at the same time. If I have $10 billion to spend this year on increasing my capacity, and spectrum for whatever external reason is ridiculously expensive, because maybe foreclosure happens after all, I'm better off just spending it on towers, even though long term that may not be a viable or a long-term strategic option. So I wonder if that's not really also a bound on that spectrum prices are given by the perception of the alternative, namely just simply expanding, given existing capacity, your tower footprint or your deployment, your cell size for particular frequency or whatever.
I think I lost the final question, but certainly, I mean, it is certainly true that, you know, as if the price of spectrum varies, then my relative willingness to, you know, my relative interest in growing my capacity via spectrum versus growing it with towers will change. If spectrum becomes much more expensive, then yeah, I will shift that ratio and I will build more towers. The optimal ratio will be a higher number of towers per square kilometer versus megahertz of spectrum. If spectrum goes down, it will have the opposite effect. I think you also said something about the number of towers therefore affecting.
No, I mean, what I was saying is, if everybody has the same cost structure, you would reach an equilibrium, because everybody would make the same calculation and say, I mean, it's silly for me to spend more than X dollars per pop on spectrum, because I would be better off spending it at American Tower, and I get much more bang for that. And so if you're not strictly spectrum constrained, in the sense that there's more money than spectrum available, you would kind of have incrementally the same cost at any given time as to the projected alternative of investment, namely buying more towers, that people are willing to bid in that.
If it is true that if all of the cost structures are the same, then that is what all of the carriers pay per megahertz of spectrum, what all of them pay per tower deployed,
yes,
capacity constrained. If all of those things are equal, then I should end up with basically the same ratio of cell tower density to spectrum holdings. But the larger carriers will be getting their cost at lower capacity, or excuse me, capacity at lower cost.
Yeah. But
they will all end up with the same ratio.
Yeah. But I mean, you kind of assumed you started an equal and you then did incremental steps.
I guess I assumed that I didn't care about history. I assumed that at this moment you have the most cost-effective allocation of resources for that capacity. Should also say that what you're willing to bid at auction depends in part on, for spectrum, depends on part on whether you could get your capacity cheaper through towers. It also depends on what kind of revenue you could get.
Sure.
And so, the demand side could also change what spectrum is worth at auction, as well as the cost side.
Yep.
John, do we have time for one last quick question?
I'm afraid I got to get to class. Thank you for the invite.
Okay. I guess next we have Greg Rosston from Stanford, who was advising T-Mobile in the last auction. And Jason, can you get the slides up? Yeah, he'll talk about spectrum, the incentive auction. I guess you're going to talk more about overlays rather than the reserve, but why don't I hand it over to you, Greg?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Greg.
Okay, great. So I want to thank David and Ellie for inviting me to this, and for all the great work that CITI has done for so long on this. It's been a great place for pushing the envelope forward on telecom and understanding what's going on around the world. My disclosure is that I've been involved with auctions for a long time. I was at the FCC when we designed the first spectrum auctions in the United States. And as David said, most recently I advised T-Mobile in the incentive auction. I want Ellie teed this up with some provocative comments about spectrum auctions, and I want to discuss that for a few minutes before I start going into my presentation, because you know, it is, why is it so long and why is it so complex? It's not the auctions, it's the fact that we did not assign licenses in a reasonable way for television stations, for example. We assigned them for television stations in site-specific manner. Had we assigned them in a wide area geographic license with flexibility, we wouldn't have had to have the incentive auction. If you look at what happened with cellular telephone licenses, they were cellular telephone licenses. Now they're mobile internet licenses, but there's been no change by the FCC other than granting them additional flexibility to do this stuff. They were relatively easy to change, and it was the market that pushed it as opposed to the FCC pushing it. So I think it's not the auction. This auction was complex, I grant that, but we would not have needed any of this if we had a better licensing scheme. I also think, Ellie, you've talked about not auctioning stuff for a long time. In fact, when we auctioned in 1994, I recall you saying we shouldn't be auctioning licenses, we should have these real-time, incredibly complex real-time auctions. And I think that we would have had hundreds of billions of dollars of consumer welfare lost if we hadn't had licenses that have pushed 2G and 3G and 4G and now coming up on 5G services, complementing the unlicensed stuff, as John Peha said. So I think the real key is not exclusivity versus non-exclusivity, but flexibility for licensees and for users, for unlicensed as well. So flexibility in use is going to be the key. So that's, now let's see if I can switch to the next slide. So what I want to talk about in this is, originally was sort of spectrum allocation choices. How does the FCC decide what to do with the spectrum? Then the auction, the actual auction, go through a little bit of the recent auction, and then talk about what alternative policy choices there were. So the first is, key question for regulators: how do you choose what spectrum should be used for, and then who should get to use the spectrum? If you do what the FCC has moved to since 1994, is you say, we're going to grant very, very flexible licenses, and therefore we don't have to choose as much what the spectrum should be used for. And there's a big asterisk to this, and I'll take it to that second. The second, then, who should get to use it? Well, then you hold an auction because the highest value user should get to use it. What should the spectrum be used for? The asterisk on that is satellites. Right now, satellite providers want their spectrum to be decided by administrative procedures, whereas the rest of spectrum is not. And I would argue that we should have flexibility in use, and you could use it either for terrestrial or satellite. But satellites seem to want to stay special. You can see that, how did we get to this two-sided auction, the broadcast reallocation auction? I always call incentive auction, and I say that every auction is an incentive auction, so I don't like the term incentive auction unless you capitalize incentive auction. In 1994, a third of households used over-the-air television, and by 10 years later, it was 15%. We may be changing back to some extent to more over-the-air as people cut the cord and watch more online. But the beauty is that now the policymakers don't have to choose whether we should be allocating more or less spectrum to broadcasting. They were able to let the market decide that, rather than this is a policy choice, but the policymakers didn't have to make this choice, that consumers could actually decide whether it should be used more for mobile broadband or for this over-the-air television. This is, they don't have to be the decider, as we had a decider in June of 2004 trying to get us off of analog television and awarding the digital television licenses. So what the FCC did was, it came up for this auction was a band plan, and it it had several different band plans. You can see from this chart that it possibly would reallocate up to 144 megahertz of spectrum to get 12 paired blocks. If the far left column is the number of paired blocks of 10 megahertz each, and there is more television stations in the second column from the left because of guard bands, and also because of and then channel 37. You can see on the far right there are there's unlicensed spectrum, and then in the middle in orange is channel 37, which has to be protected. So in between send and receive channels, you can see the 11 megahertz kind of angling down to the side. That's a duplex gap. So the FCC was able, on the top, thought it might be able to get 12 blocks of send and receive channels down to possibly as small as 2 in that. So the FCC started with a reverse auction where they said to the broadcasters, we're going to give you a lot of money, and you tell us what you're willing to do for that amount of money. They could say, we're going to exit the auction. We're not going to tender our license, and we get $0. They could switch bands from a high band to a lower band and get some money, or they could be willing to sell out and get more money. So those were the 3 options for broadcasters in the reverse auction. The prices started up very high and went down. When you start with a high price, you had an excess supply of stations willing to relinquish or move, and then you would lower your price until you got to your clearing target level for that stage. And the prices would stop decreasing once there was no excess supply, once you hit the target. Okay. And this is the reverse auction mechanics. It kind of sounded simple on the previous slide. It's very, very complicated, and I'm not going to get into the complexity of it, but it's an incredible number of constraints because television stations are not all at the same place, and they don't all broadcast with the same power, and the frequencies propagate differently. So the repacking of the television stations is pretty complex. You can see from this the opening prices where the FCC started out at very high prices. These are just an example of the opening prices in New York, where some of them moving off the air were, the highest price was $900 million. Yeah, $900 million. So nearly $1 billion to move off the air for one station in New York, and $700, $800, $900 million for the opening prices. These did not end up being paid, but they were where we started to make sure that we would get, the FCC started so it would make sure it would get some attention from the broadcasters. There are lots of real world complications in this that I kind of mentioned, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that. The reverse auction results, they ran several rounds, and then I'll talk about the forward auction that came in. The initial target in that band plan was 126 megahertz, and they were trying to get to 126 megahertz. The clock started at $341 billion and came down quite a bit, but not, it stopped at 86 billion. 86 billion was very clearly, to participants in the auction, far more money than the forward auction participants were going to have. So we were pretty sure as bidders that it was not going to close at that stage. The second, and it did not. Then there was a second target at 114, which went down by $30 billion. And then the third target was 108 megahertz, came down by another $14 billion. And the fourth and final target was 84 megahertz. You can see there's quite a big jump between the third and fourth target, meaning that a lot fewer television stations had to be cleared in every area. And so the quantity went down, and also the price went down a lot. So that the price went from 40 billion down to $10 billion. In the forward auction, the FCC structured this as an ascending clock auction, and it wanted to make sure the auction went as fast as possible. It didn't go as, I think they could have done some things to make both the forward and the reverse auction go more rapidly, and it could have taken less than a year. I agree with Ellie that was far too long for how long it took for what was done. But they wanted to make sure that it was simple for the broadcasters to understand and make sure that nobody made mistakes, because there's lots of billions of dollars at stake. There were generic licenses in each geographic area. So in the end, you were bidding for 1 or 2 or 3 licenses of the 7, but you didn't know which one you were bidding for. You could get any of them. They were the same across the area. And prices were different in New York than San Francisco, obviously. And there was an increasing clock auction. And the FCC also, as John and David said, had a competition policy included in this. They had a reserve, and I'll talk a little bit about the reserve, but the reserve only kicked in once the revenue requirement was met. The revenue requirement was we had to pay off the broadcasters, plus the FCC had a minimum amount of money that it expected to get as well. So that's just the band plan again, and you can see that they came down on this. And in thinking about this from economics terms, if the revenue requirement, for example, that $86 billion was too high, it reduces the clearing target. The revenue requirement goes down because both P and Q go down. And so that makes it easier to clear. But this, now you can see I've added the red on the right, shows you how much was raised in the forward auction when they were trying to sell 100 megahertz. They only raised 23 billion. When they tried to sell 90 megahertz, even though prices per license went up, the total revenue went down because quantity went down from 10 licenses to 9 licenses in each market. And you can see down that the revenue ended up being $19.6 billion for 70 megahertz, which was sufficient to clear the $10 billion. Each time you were reducing the number of licenses in almost every market. Because of Canada and Mexico, there were some license areas where the actual numbers of licenses went up. For example, in Los Angeles, the licenses, even though they were selling 10 licenses in the rest of the country, they were only selling 4 in Los Angeles. And this was something that we actually noticed and were ready to take advantage of. And I think our client is very happy with the 3 licenses we got in Los Angeles by coming back at the 70 megahertz stage and bidding for one of the extra Los Angeles licenses that came about because of an anomaly in the auction structure. So now that's kind of how the auction worked, and it cleared, and it was very successful. Some people, notably Tom Hazlett, thinks has a proposal that would do something that I think that Ellie might like, which in part, it still does have exclusive licenses, which I don't think Ellie likes, but it does. Tom said that we should just simply do an overlay license, have a license that says you get the rights to all the unused spectrum in both frequency and in geography over a broad area, and then you can negotiate with the broadcasters to get them off the air. So Tom proposed to have these licenses A through G and have 42 megahertz per license, and said just auction those maybe on a nationwide basis and allow that person to negotiate with the underlying TV licenses. So what the FCC's auction did was it was a centralized market. It was not a market where you had these overlay licenses. It forced stations to evaluate their positions and think about what it was I would be willing to sell for. In a closed world without transactions costs, I think Tom's would work just fine if there were no transactions costs. But, and this is a huge but, there are a lot of transactions costs to clear 70 megahertz. I think the FCC's auction set a lower bound for transactions costs. There were 145 stations that sold for $8.8 billion. And 30 of those, 30 that actually moved so 145 sold out saying they basically turned off, and 30 moved for another $1.2 billion. And then the FCC had the ability to force stations to move without any premium compensation. The FCC paid for their movement costs, or is going to pay, and this is part of Ellie's 39 months. I agree, this is a real question, is how long will it take to get them to move? But this 39 months under the Hazlett proposal would take at least that long as well. So there would be lots of negotiations in the overlay world. In the 84 megahertz that was cleared, there are 521 television stations. So that's the minimum number of transactions that you would have to undertake in order to clear 84 megahertz, because you have to talk to all the stations that are in the 84 to get them to clear. There are 2,000 stations in the whole band. If you really wanted to minimize the total cost, you'd want to talk to everybody to see who would be willing to go out. And so there are lots of excuse me, lots of transactions that you'd have to undertake. And for the 145 that are actually going off the air, 59 of them are going off the air in the 84 megahertz, but there are a lot that are moving. There are some that are being paid to move out of the 84 megahertz, and some are going off the air outside the 84 megahertz. So presumably the 86 going off the air out of the 84 megahertz were willing to go off the air for less than the ones that were moving from the cleared amount down lower. So this is basically, this is a lot of numbers that show you that this picture is, it shows you there will be huge numbers of transactions cost to undertake to do this. And trying to be the holdout to prevent the shopping mall is what every single station would have wanted to do. They would want to be the ones that would make it hard for AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile and Sprint to have their mobile broadband. So that was something. So there's there are also some additional layers of complication. You might have free rider problems with negotiating if you had only a single license. If you did not have a single license, I might clear a station out that benefited the person who had the 42 megahertz next to me. So, excuse me, a solution might be having a single overlay, but that could affect competition. And the FCC cared about competition in this auction. And so Tom had put together a scoreboard where he, in a paper, and he took guts to put this together, where he said, here's what I think is going to happen in this, that the overlay is better than the FCC. And I think the ending is policy delay. In the first one was policy took longer, but the actual radio service delay is what you care about. And I think the FCC's method wins. The authority is not a problem, it's irrelevant. The amount of spectrum reallocated, he thinks the overlay was gonna reallocate a whole lot, but I think that it would not have, because of these huge transactions cost again. And then rigidities, he thinks that the overlay would get more flexibility into the marketplace. I think I have a couple of minutes left. David asked me to talk about the reserve. The reserve was something the FCC was concerned about, whether AT&T and Verizon would have an incentive to foreclose either smaller players, either new entrants or smaller providers. It turned out they originally didn't have an idea. DMR stands for Dynamic Market Rule, that Andy Skripich of Stanford and I proposed as a different way of doing it. It turns out that the FCC's reserve did not play a role in actual prices, because Verizon didn't participate and AT&T dropped from the auction as rapidly as it could once it won the first net spectrum. But the reserve did give bidders confidence to come to the auction, knowing that they would have a chance to bid for spectrum and possibly get it at a reasonable price without being foreclosed. So I think that was at least being privy to conversations within one bidder, something that did play a role in the auction. So in terms of trying to speed it up, the FCC could think about bid increments. It went too high on the supply increases. I think that I've said a lot about the transactions costs for overlay licenses in this case. I think overlays can and should be used in the future for different places, but think about what critical property rights there and when you should have a centralized market player. In the end, I think the FCC did a great job, and I think I'll stop there and see if there's time for questions. I can't hear.
I'll ask a question.
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
Do you think it will be another incentive auction?
Excuse me, can you say that again?
Do you think there will be another incentive auction?
Another incentive auction. You know, I think it really depends whether, I think one of the things that John mentioned was the technology changes. I think there should be a mechanism to increase flexibility for the remaining part of the broadcast television band, and to completely and pervasively license it so that we don't have to keep going back and making technology choices. I think that would, you know, but whether it's better to do that with an overlay or having another incentive auction is a very good question. Maybe, you know, it depends on what your alternatives are for where people can go if they decide to remain in the band or not, remain in the business or not. And I think that, you know, over time, over-the-air television broadcasting to me is still something that is the value of that is likely to change further. That the marginal television broadcasters in a lot of areas still, it would be better to try to reallocate that spectrum for mobile broadband.
Okay, I have a question. Can you hear me, Greg?
Yes.
Okay. Question came up in another discussion today about the reserve, and there was no discount for the reserve spectrum basically in the auction. So it did help. You know, T-Mobile didn't end up having to face competition from AT&T and Verizon, but you think that was a good policy to have a reserve that was going to basically result in the same price for reserve and non-reserve spectrum?
So I don't think it hurt the auction. That's kind of how when we designed our dynamic market rule, and I think the same thing is true with the FCC's one, is if there was no difference, then it didn't hurt, and it might have helped. It might have prevented. You know, one could argue that, hey, this took away any incentive for attempted foreclosure, and therefore not seeing it. Just like I locked my door, no one stole my television. That doesn't mean that locking my door was useless.
No, I hear you. I hear you. There were scenarios, I think you're aware that foreclosure could have occurred with that. With the reserve policy they had, but it would have taken a different pattern of bidding than we saw. And obviously, when AT&T stopped bidding after stage one and Verizon never entered a bid, it was no longer a relevant issue, right?
Right. It was no longer a relevant issue. There were definitely concerns about, you know, you know, a bidder who wanted to foreclose could have used the FCC strategy to try and implement a foreclosure strategy. We think our DMR strategy would have prevented some of those even more, but it was a more complex strategy, more complex bidding rules as well, and might have been more politically harder to politically sell.
Understand. Were there any other questions?
Yeah, this is Heather Hudson.
Hi, Heather.
Hi. My question is a little more generic, I guess. There have been some reverse auctions for spectrum for mobile in rural, remote, and tribal regions in the U.S. And almost without exception, with very minor exceptions, there's been only one bidder. So the spectrum got allocated, but the notion of using pricing to or competition to assess what might be a good price didn't seem to work, and I think that's sometimes true in developing countries. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about auctions for areas where there may not be either as much interest in competing for spectrum, or where small players don't have the background to get into even though they're eligible.
Connect America Fund auctions, reverse auctions for providing service to rural areas. And these are auctions where they try to get people to, they start at a higher price and have people bid down on their willingness to pay for providing service to an area. And I think you're right, there have been areas where there's only been a single provider willing to pay for those areas. One of the interesting things to try to structure, and there was a group of economists who submitted something to the BTOP and BTOP program in 2008 to get it, since there's a limited amount of money, to try to create competition between areas. Since if there are two areas each with a single provider and you only have enough money to provide service in one area, then the two providers might actually reveal their true cost or closer to their true cost. So there is still some benefit to try to bid down the rights to provide service, but even in some areas that are very high cost areas, you might get a provider who says, I'm not going to provide the auction, and I know the FCC, I know the government is going to end up giving me whatever I tell them is my cost to provide service. So somehow, if the FCC says, well, the auction isn't real, these costs are going to be high, and these single providers will get a lot of money. Other questions?
Other questions?
David, I think we're running behind schedule.
Okay. Next.
The next speaker is, in fact, David himself. So I will, in this particular case, moderate the session with David being the speaker. So David, go ahead.
Okay, slides.
First, just a minute. First, David, you may want to, or I will thank Greg very much for giving us the information. It was really very informative and thoughtful, and I have learned a lot. So, Greg, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Very, very helpful. Okay, I'm now the presenter, so I'm not sure I know how to use the slides. Do I do it or you do it?
That's correct. Above your.
Oh, I can do it. I can do it. Okay. So, I'm actually going to talk more about a related research paper I've been working on, and talk a little bit in the context of the incentive auction. So, one of the big issues in these auctions is how these auctions interact with the competitive dynamics of the market in the sector over time. Obviously, these auctions for spectrum affect competition in the market for mobile services or wireless services after the auction. And the market structure going into the auction affects the ability and the incentives of the various participants to bid. So, and then on top of that, regulators make a bunch of designs. I asked one in Greg's presentation about spectrum reserve. The U.S. Adopted this spectrum reserve policy, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail. But other countries have used things like caps, floors, set-asides, bidding credits. And there's a question of how well does the auction work with all of the bells and whistles to achieve what should be the policy goals. And in most countries, it's usually stated explicitly that revenues aren't the primary goal. On the other hand, in most countries, it seems they care about revenues. So just sort of, this is a longer presentation, just to, it's based on a fairly lengthy research project. I'm going to skip over some parts of it. I'll give a brief introduction, then talk a little bit about US, and then talk a little bit about the results of our research analysis. So basically, regulatory agencies like the FCC, they're allocating scarce radio frequency rights, and there are asymmetries going into this auction. There's AT&T and Verizon were the two larger carriers. They had the bulk of the low band spectrum, which was being cleared. And there are two other carriers that the number 3 and 4 were Sprint and T-Mo. Sprint had like 12 megahertz. T-Mo had close similar amounts, but it had a few holes, like 15-20% of the country. They had no low band coverage. Low band frequency is important, providing good quality service, especially in building, but also it's important for minimizing capex. And then in context with John Peha's presentation, if you want to equalize the ability of the different carriers to compete and make the market competitive as possible, you presumably want to make sure that the outcome of the process is doesn't leave too bad of asymmetries in spectrum holdings. Now, so that generally leads to policies being in place, such as reserve set-asides, etc. On the other hand, sometimes the regulatory agency will have some incentive to, or face pressures not to give the spectrum away or even maximize auction proceeds. So what I've been working on with Patrick Ray of Toulouse is we've been looking at what the interaction of these two policies are and how they play out. And so the auctions generally start with asymmetric bidders. And so one of the questions we ask is how the ex-ante asymmetry affects the optimal allocation, how the optimal auction design, the outcome, and ex post market shares. The theoretical model talks about a very simple stylized situation where you have a large incumbent against a weaker entrant, and the entrant has very little or no spectrum. The results of the theoretical model, this is not what Ellie said I would say, so I hope you're surprised. The optimal allocation will tend to equalize spectrum holdings when auction revenues are not a consideration, limits asymmetry otherwise. We have some results about whether auction, so very often there's sequences of auctions. So before in the incentive auction, there's AWS3. For AWS3, there was AWS1, there's PCS, there's a whole sequence of auctions. We look at sequential versus simultaneous auctions. We look at different auction forms like Vickery and clock auctions. I probably won't have time to talk about all that today, but I may get to it, and there's a slide deck online. Just to look at the issue, this sector has been getting more concentrated over time. So I first worked on, I think maybe Greg did too, my first spectrum auction was 1994. It wasn't quite as long as this auction. I did have 3 kids born during it. It went 5 months and I have triplets, but anyway, but it was still a long auction. At that time, though, the market was you had 2 mobile operators in every part of the U.S., and the FCC was allocating a total of I think 6 new blocks, A through F, 230s and CDF, 330s and 310s, 120 megahertz throughout the U.S. Some of the spectrum was set aside for what's called designated entities, a long, tortuous history. But the idea was they were allocating spectrum to have a 3rd, 4th, 5th, in most cases even a 6th operator in each market. And so the whole setting for the auction is quite different. But then if you look at those auctions ended around 2000, and the HHIs, measure of concentration at that time, was around a little over 2,000, which is sort of saying there's close to 5 bidders in each market, 5 operators in each market. As of 2015, the HHI was up to over 3,000, which means there's down to a little more than 3 effective competitors in 2000 and to 2014. If you look at the concentration in other countries, Austria went from 6 to 3, Germany 6-3, Netherlands to 3 or 4, depending how you count. Italy's gone from 5 to now 3, Switzerland 4-3, maybe going down to 2. UK stayed about stable. So this issue about, you know, what the spectrum policy ought to be toward an allocation policy and competition is not unique to the United States. Let's see, I can get the next slide. And this next slide just looks at a few countries when they've implemented caps or they haven't. It's sort of informative, so let me go through it a bit. The Dutch auction, which is about 5 years ago now, they were for 800, 900, and 1800 were the primary bands. There was no cap. There are 3 incumbents, Vodafone, KPN, and Deutsche Telekom. These are all the sub 2 gigahertz spectrum was basically up for sale. So if you didn't win stuff, you were out of the market. There was a set aside of 2 blocks of 800. And so those 2 blocks were not available for the 3 incumbents. So when I said you're out of the market, it wasn't totally out of the market, because even if, say, Deutsche Telekom, which didn't win any 800, won nothing else, they'd be able to form a joint venture with the 800 winner of the 2 blocks, and they had 2100 and 2600 spectrum. So there's some opportunity to stay in the market. They'd be a bit impaired. The prices there, you see, were it was about it was 186 euros a pop, and I think 3.8 billion euros, which is pretty high. If you look at Austria, which has lower ARPUs, which is a lot lower last auction, they had a very similar setup ex ante as Netherlands. They were offering 2 set-aside blocks, but nobody appeared, so they put the 2 set-aside blocks back to the auction for everybody. And they had caps on every band, and they had caps for the low band 800, 900, and caps for the overall. And nobody showed up, but despite the fact that nobody showed up, they got roughly 1/3 more per megahertz per pop for similar amounts of spectrum than Netherlands. That auction almost ended in a knockout of having only 2 players survive. So the caps themselves don't necessarily help. Set-asides themselves don't usually necessarily help. It's a pretty complicated question at what the right policy should be. I put in the UK, they had floors, and they also had a CCA, and they had fairly low prices, and they had some entry. And they sort of forced the entry, although there's been subsequent consolidation. Switzerland's only had three operators for quite a while, and they had fairly low prices. I'm going to. I've already talked about this slide, but you know, this consolidation's been going on after the initial wave of auctions. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the incentive auctions, and I could spend several hours talking about it. We've spent a few years on this. We have 4 nationwide carriers, misspelled, sorry, on the slide: AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint. Concentration's been increasing. As I said before, 2 smaller carriers are very low of the low band spectrum, less than half of what AT&T and Verizon have on average. Sprint was in a bad financial position. They never showed up to bid. I think arguably because there was a provision in the reserve that said the reserve would only kick in when, roughly speaking, the price hit $1.25 in the major markets. And even $1.25,
David,
yes, yeah.
David, this is Ellie. I have to, yes, you're the conference organizer, but I'm the moderator of this session, and your time is up in about 5 minutes.
I
And I
know.
observed that you are on slide 8 out of 36. So keep the time in mind, please.
Yeah, I have it in mind. Thanks. Um, so Sprint, I would argue that the $1.25, which would translate into about 4 billion per block, or maybe 8 billion for 2 blocks, was just too much for Sprint to absorb. So that may by itself have discouraged their participation. Uh, and so the final stage rule basically said that the there would be no reserve spectrum unless the clearing unless you cover the clearing cost and roughly $1.25 per megahertz pop in the major markets. So what happened? Well, Sprint didn't enter. T-Mobile, who was a had been number 4, but became overtook Sprint and was improving its financials and market shares. They won 20 to 30 megahertz in virtually all the markets. There was no discount for this effective discount for the reserved spectrum. Indeed, in roughly 20% of the markets, the reserve spectrum sold at a premium relative to the non-reserved. And not only that, Verizon never entered a bid. They did register, and AT&T stopped bidding after the start of stage 2. And the lack of the price difference was probably predictable based on the final stage rule trigger. Okay, so Ellie says I don't have much time, which he's right, and I'm going to skip the literature, but if you want to look, there's tons of papers been done. I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory. I'm going to skip the setup and sort of, well, I'll spend a little bit about the setup and then go right to what the theory says. What if you take the analysis of a model, and there's a little bit of algebra here, but I'll just explain it quickly. So we consider a setup where you have an incumbent and an entrant or a challenger, and the incumbent starts with much more spectrum than the challenger. And we're going to take a very simple framework where they sort of, the services are commodities that compete in price. Standard demand, and all the spectrum does is the more spectrum you have, the lower your capacity cost. This is very actually consistent with the Peha approach to modeling cost. And so there's new spectrum available. There's a big chunk, we call it delta. And that means that with the new chunk available, maybe the entrant can catch up, maybe the entrant can pass the incumbent, but one or both firms can lower their costs. Obviously, if the entrant or challenger doesn't get much and the incumbent gets all the spectrum, perhaps the entrant's really out of the market, no longer effective competitor. So that's the basic setup. So the question is what should be done and what would be the optimal allocation? Well, first of all, in a first best world, if the regulator wants to maximize welfare, then it wants to allocate all the spectrum and it wants to minimize the cost difference. Basically, it wants to, this is basically saying what Peha was saying, you want to equate make the firms equal, then you need to minimize the cost differences and give them, that may not be equalizing spectrum holdings, you may not be able to, but it may actually mean give all the spectrum to the entrant. I mean, this is not what's normally happened. There's an auction coming up in Switzerland with Swisscom has 62% market share. They're not going to give all the spectrum to the number 2 and 3 player, but that's what the prescription should be. But now often welfare depends on revenues. So we're going to look at where revenues matter, and that's on this slide. There's a W has revenues and transfers in it. and it's still optimal to allocate all the spectrum, but the proposition is the spectrum that maximizes welfare will yield an equilibrium price, which is uniquely defined and lies above the cost that sort of gives a price that's above the cost that equalizes spectrum holdings. And then how you do so and what happens sort of depends on where the cost differentials start. It may be optimal if the entrant can't catch up very much to give all the spectrum to the incumbent. That's condition one. It may be optimal to allocate all the spectrum to the entrant. Otherwise, so that's a case where you can get the entrant pretty close, and that dominates. And then the third case is that there could be you might equalize cost, but not purely. You might want to, in certain cases, maintain this cost advantage to the incumbent. In other cases, again, depending on initial cost conditions, there are two optimal allocations. You don't really care, the regulator shouldn't care who gets the cost advantage, but one firm should end up with a cost advantage. Now you ask, why should you leave somebody with a cost advantage? If you make the costs equal, then there's no revenues, auction revenues. And then remember, in this setup, you need to have auction revenues. Yes. So that's the main result, that you want to do that. Now, I'm going to mention a couple results because I'm sure Ellie's going to cut the mic any minute. Ellie's ruthless, right? So basically, I'm not going to use the slides, but basically the two other results are, in the world where the regulator can't really, has to rely on the auction to figure out what the cost differential is. So regulator generally won't know how strong each player is. In that world, you can't really rely on the auction to have the bidders tell you how big their handicap is. Competition doesn't work. It breaks down. And so what you want to do in that case is give the entrant an opportunity to buy a fixed amount of spectrum independent of its cost disadvantage. So if you start in a world, you don't know how much you have to offset the entrant to allow it to catch up to the incumbent, you don't use the auction to try to sort to figure out an optimal. It doesn't work. You can't get too good a solution. And the reason it has to do with the incentive properties, that if you try to get sorting a more efficient outcome, the entrant will want to distort its cost advantage, and so that will fall apart. Second result, and I'm going to conclude with that, we looked at different auction designs. So we looked at sequential auctions, we looked at pay as bid, and we looked at what's called victory auctions, where the bidders pay what the value is the rivals would pay for their blocks. It turns out the auction design can matter, and so in certain cases, the victory auction, for instance, could be more prone to concentration than, say, a pay as bid auction. Anyway, I'll end my presentation there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We are kind of going to be out of time, but perhaps a question, maximum two, I will collect. I don't see any raised hands. Is there anybody who would like to jump in with a question? While you think, I will have a quick question, which is, one of your results showed that the efficient result is not the revenue maximizing results, correct? And if that's the case, then if you reverse that and say, therefore, possibly the revenue maximizing result is not the efficient one, but the revenue maximizing result is perhaps more likely politically. Therefore, we are going to have inefficient results in auctions.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely inefficient. They're all second best, although in reality, the way we set it up, Elliot, is that the regulator is not going to go for maximizing revenue. That's monopoly outcome. They'll trade that off. So they want to trade off competition versus revenue.
Okay, good point. If there are no other questions on the table, we will then thank David, who will now resume his role as the moderator for our final speaker. So, David, take it again.
Yeah, we have. I'm happy that we have Jose Cepeda, who advised a larger number of, helped a larger number of reverse auction bidders get prepared, and I guess you worked with one in detail in advance of the auction, and helping a little bit with the strategy. So basically, Jose's, I guess, director at FTI Consulting and the telecommunicate. I think it's called TMT practice. And Jose, you want to take it from here?
Sure. Thank you, David. My name is, again, Jose Cepeda, and I do work with FTI Consulting and work with David many times. And we're in the telecom media technology practice of corporate finance. And my background is really from banking, investment banking, and working at with GE Capital and BNP Paribas, and now I'm with FTI Consulting. So I'm not a economist or game theory spectrum expert at all. We focused a lot in this process working with the broadcast base, with the TV broadcasters. We had about a range of probably like 10 to 15 different clients in the beginning, and we did very preliminary valuation analysis, trying to figure out how much their spectrum would be worth in the reverse auction, given the public information that was provided by the FCC. We developed some models and used that to advise our clients how to proceed forward. And then later on, we worked with one broadcast, one of the major players, to help them with the spectrum process and develop the war room and bidding strategy and so on and so forth. So we were in the early rounds of stage one working with them. So overall, we have a lot of relationship with the broadcast and industry, the TV broadcasters. So this presentation is more giving a business view, a business perspective on the reverse auction and what our broadcaster clients seen and what some of their perceptions were and expectations and what some key observations that we witnessed during the auction. Okay. That said, as you all know, the auction did complete on March 29th. It lasted 4 stages, as all the speakers have stated. Here you can see the light blue line showing the price point for the reverse auction, starting at $88 billion in stage 1, ending down to roughly $12 billion, which is really $10 billion plus about $175 billion for relocation costs for the repacking as a transactional cost that the FCC will be reimbursing the broadcast space. The mobile side, the forward auction started roughly at $22.5 billion and ended up at $19 billion. So the FCC did pretty well. It collected about $7 billion of net proceeds. And the auction took a long time for sure. Over 9 months, I would say. The $10.6 billion here, you can see in this graph the map of the United States, and there you can see who were the winners. And the size of the circles, the size of proceeds received by station. You could tell the Northeast corridor, as expected, was to be a very hot area and a lot of activity for an opportunity for broadcast to sell their spectrum. And then the California side was another pocket. And then you had random pockets in the southeast and Texas, which wasn't much opportunity there. The big winners you can see here, about $10 billion being spread. The top 15 companies or entities accounted roughly 50% of the proceeds. You had private equity companies, NRJ, which is owned by Fortress, OTA by Michael Dell, were one of the largest winners. I think these people knew the auction was coming, and way ahead they started buying TV stations in preparation for this auction. So they did have a nice payout in that process. The operated and owned stations, which we call the NBCs, the Fox, the CBS, ABCs, and the major networks, and as well as the large station group owners, which we consider to be Sinclair, the Nexstars, the Media Generals of the world. They all participated, and most of them really looked at selling duopolies, existing duopolies. So if they had two stations within the market, they would sell at least one of them and continue their business. Okay. So what's some of our observations from a business perspective? I think when we step back, we saw four major items. The first was the high expectations set before the auction started. A lot of people were looking at the AWS auction as the benchmark, and then you had certain analysts predicting over $80 billion of proceeds will clear with 100 megahertz. So the chatter before the auction started was a big question mark whether or not this 84 billion, the 80 or 100 billion dollar was a real number. So that was number one. Our second major observation was the low demand on the forward auction. Only T-Mobile was the only of the bigger four that came in and really was active, which put a damper on the forward auction, I think, and the prices. So as David said, the AT&T and the Verizon, the Sprints did not really participate. The third was we felt there was low-level participation by broadcasters. I think that was one of the key drivers for the high value in stage one. We observed a lot of stations in markets like New York, Philadelphia, froze in stage one and opening the first round. So that kind of led us to believe there was low participation by some of the stations out there in the market, causing congestion. And the fourth observation that we noticed was between stages 3 and 4, the value dropped so much. It dropped from 40 billion down to 10 billion. And so that's going back to this graph here, that this drop here from basically $1.71 megahertz pop to a 55 cents megahertz pop was pretty dramatic, and I don't think many people were expecting that. Okay, so the high expectation, as I mentioned, I think this chart kind of summarized. I think most analysts were looking at these auctions, historical auctions, and looking at the megahertz price per pop, and our incentive auction was around 87 cents per megahertz pop. What was it where it cleared? So clearly did not meet expectation there. People were expecting much higher value for their spectrum. And obviously, and below you can see the quote for the $84 billion of proceeds on the forward side, which never materialized. The low demand, as we mentioned, the expectation on the street was about a $30 billion. A lot of the Wall Street analysts estimated there will be at least $30 billion of proceeds in the forward auction to be that will be used to buy the spectrum on the reverse side. You can see there the allocation on the bottom right. We calculated what the average was. So it was the analysts were estimating around $32 billion on average, expecting AT&T to be there with 8.7, Verizon 6.5, T-Mobile 8.3, Comcast 3.5, and Dish 1, and others 4.4. What really happened, only 19.8 billion showed up. As you can see, AT&T only had 900 million. Verizon did not participate. T-Mobile did come in line roughly to the numbers people were estimating, around 8 billion. Comcast came much lower, from 3.5 to 1.7. However, Dish stepped up given the low values. I believe they sensed opportunity and they bought 6.2 billion versus the one that people were estimating. The reasoning why, this is our view of why the three players did not participate, and I think David already hit some of these in prior. Basically, Sprint, we feel they're highly levered and they just didn't have capacity to be able to really participate, and the leverage is very high and they're having some troubles in the financial performance. So they did not participate more for that reason. I think it was more for financial issues. Verizon, we felt, again, the debt level was around pretty high, 3.5 times EBITDA. However, they've been busy doing acquisitions. They were acquiring Yahoo, AOL, XO at that time. And they also had spent about $10 billion already in AWS-3 spectrum. So I think they were pretty busy with that. And they had to sell off assets to generate enough proceeds to be able to buy that spectrum. So it seems like they were tapped out. AT&T, basically same story, with debt being relatively high. They already spent $18 billion already in the AWS-3 auction, and they just recently closed on the $49 billion DirecTV acquisition. So strategically, they didn't seem to have the capacity to buy more spectrum or be able to play in the big way in this last auction. So I think that's some of the reasonings from an analyst perspective. The other items, I think, from thinking back, what has affected the behavior of bidders. Obviously, as I mentioned, the timing was one, and also probably the auction mechanics had some impact. The auction started more than a year after a completion of AWS-3 auction, I think, and there they spent over $40 billion at that time. So the timing, is not ideal. 1 year after, not enough time for them to digest the AWS-3 spectrum. So I think it was kind of accelerated schedule to start it that fast. Second, obviously the M&A activity was high with the AT&T acquiring, doing those acquisitions. Third, I think the duration of the auction, 9 months, I think could have posed some problems for corporate office. And I think the fourth item is the uncertainty around this type of auction. The spectrum itself will not be available beyond 2020 after the repacking. So that alone creates uncertainty and concern to invest so much billions of dollars on spectrum that's not immediately available. And then obviously the band plan being determined during the auction. So it just makes it harder for people in corporate to be planning with so many unknowns, dealing with billions and billions of dollars. Okay. Another on the seller side, the TV broadcast side, we felt there was some low participation, and three factors I think drove it. It was strategic bidding, what we call strategic bidding. Again, many station owners had multiple stations in the same markets. Those were the duopolies, and also the channel sharing arrangement. Allow them to partner with competitor station in the markets and come up with a spectrum sharing arrangement, and that way kind of limit supply in those markets. And instead of bringing 2 stations into the market, you only brought 1. So that kind of limited a little bit, I believe. Second, I think many stations did not participate for non-monetary consideration. Many smaller religious station groups out there did not participate. They were not really seeking profits. They had a bigger mission, a nonprofit mission. So it was a different, they were not incentivized by the auction. So those groups did not participate. The public broadcasting stations and the PBS is owned by public education institutions as well as local governments, did not participate. Many haven't due to their local charters. They had to go to their state legislator to get amendments and get waivers to be able to participate. So many did not for that reason. Also, they did not want to participate because they might lose their jobs as well if they went off air. So that was not in their public interest nor their personal interest to be seeking higher profits there. So we saw many station groups from religious as well as PBS as not participating for those reasons. And the third item, I think, is the value of must carry. Many broadcasters, since they own the spectrum, the cable companies must carry them. Since they're covering that footprint, the cable company must carry. That's where they get most of their viewership, through the cable system. So about 80% of the viewership is through cable today. So if they did not have that license, that spectrum, then they will not be eligible for must carry. And they might have lost their revenue streams from advertisement due to that. So many felt it wasn't worth selling their spectrum because it will lose that right and they will not be able to monetize on their advertising side. So you saw a lot of major O&Os not really participating in the auction for those reasons. And as an impact, like I said earlier, there was no bid in the most expensive markets. You saw price being frozen in round 1. And those were the New York, the LA, the Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and the Baltimore markets. For those 8 markets, roughly 90 stations froze at opening bids. So that represents roughly $38 billion of the $88 billion of the first round transaction cost to clear the market there. So I think that was pretty misleading stage 1. Now, the other phenomenon that we saw was, that I mentioned earlier, was the stage 3 to stage 4, the price dropping so much. And you can see the relative price drops. You can see a 36, 25%, and then the last stage from 3 to 4, it dropped to 72%, which is a huge drop. And I think a lot of that to do and was due to the congestion issues was alleviated with a lower megahertz plan, the 84 megahertz plan. And then obviously with the treaties that was signed with Mexico and Canada resolving the interference issues in the border, that really alleviated a lot of congestions. And obviously that got signed in 3 months before the auction started, but a lot of people did not have that in their calculus and what that impact would have been, since the information the FCC has provided us in the early stage did not have that in account. So there was a lot of guessing work that we had to do to try to quantify that impact. Then obviously the auction design in regards to the ability to move from UHF to the VHF band, I think that also had some definitely help reduce congestions in some critical markets, which lower the price at UHF, and also had some distortion in pricing You saw certain markets, the move to VHF, they'd receive greater proceeds than the people that had actually exited actually sold the auction, sold their spectrum and decided to go off air. So that was kind of unique. And then obviously the way the auction mechanics was designed, you had the low value stations in the market really driving the price. So you had a lot of small non-commercial broadcast stations out there that really put the floor on the price. So they will just keep going down, and that kind of drove the price down to the 10 billion in stage 4. And on this page here kind of shows the impact, as I mentioned, in Chicago, not having the flexibility to cross bands, moving from UHF to VHF, or deciding to go back to VHF, or if you were in VHF, if you had the flexibility to go back to UHF, or if you had permitted more competition in the VHF, because the system, the way the VHF was set up, was more of a queue process there. So we saw some pricing distortion, discrepancies, and you can see here in the first, in LaSalle, the high V there sold for 304 million with only 6 million coverage, while you had a UHF, which is a more desirable spectrum with 10 million coverage, sold almost half that price. So that did not make too much sense. So it felt like a lottery system. Certain stations did win the lottery when it came to this. So I think the key takeaways from a business perspective is that, one, the incentive auction from a broadcast perspective did not really meet the expectation. People were expecting a lot higher clearing prices, and there was some limited participation, especially on the buyer side. Just T-Mobile coming and being really the biggest winner of this auction was somewhat of a not meeting the expectation of the broadcast side. Second, I think the values expressed in this auction doesn't really represent the real value of that spectrum. I think a lot of the auction mechanics drove the value of the spectrum. So for instance, if I want to use this auction and use it as an example of what value the spectrum is truly worth, I would not be able to use this auction. I will not feel comfortable to use this last auction as a comparable for auction spectrum valuation. The third is the duration. Timing, obviously timing was a big issue, being right after, less than, about a year from the AWS-3. I think it was too soon to do this auction. It probably would have been better advised if they could have waited, because the buyers just didn't have the balance sheet capacity to really bid for that spectrum. And then obviously the auction design does matter. Did have, I think people should relook at this auction and see what lessons learned could be taken and try to improve for the next time. Okay. I think that is it. It's about 5:29. If anybody has questions, I'll be happy to take it.
Thank you, Jose. Any questions?
I'll ask, if I may. Henning speaking. I've wondered as to whether anybody has looked at whether a station could have essentially, if must-carry for must-carry stations, could have essentially bribed a local cable channel, particularly for the smaller station with a relatively small footprint, and essentially cashed out and said, I'll pay you for the next 20 years to be carried, even if I'm no longer a must carry, and I still come out ahead, particularly in more urban areas. So I wonder if that wouldn't have been a possibility.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a balance of power issue there. Many cable systems are much larger and then the smaller station groups, so they don't have the power to negotiate such a deal. So I always felt the local broadcasters are in a weaker position to negotiate, and that's the smaller broadcasting groups. If you're a large Sinclair or a Nexstar, Media General, and even Media General at the time I don't think was big enough to really dictate terms of that nature to a big cable company.
I have a question. This is Greg Rosston. You made a bunch of comments about how the structure could have been changed and it could have been done differently. Do you think that there's any chance that they could have, it seems like some of them would have reduced prices for broadcasters, like more competition between them, but it seems hard to believe that we would have gotten over the hump to get 10 or 20 more megahertz reallocated. Do you think that's true? Do you disagree with me?
That's a good, yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. I think it's, yeah, I don't know. I really can't answer that question. I feel like obviously from a forward auction, the proceeds were limited, so there's only 19 billion, and then I think if there was more participation on the TV side, that I think that would just drive the price even down further. But if the forward auction was at 30 billion, I think you would probably clear it greater than 84.
The other point I'd like to make is the big drop.
I could be wrong.
The big drop from 40 to 10 wasn't a surprise to some of us sitting there in the auction. That, given that you were going from, all of a sudden it went from 2 stations down, 1 station down. This was a jump of 6 stations down. It seemed like it was pretty. We expected it to be cleared easily. So.
Yeah. That was our expectation too. We were thinking more like an 84.
Okay, this is Ellie. I think we are now reaching the end of our time. We've allocated just a few minutes for a concluding discussion, and I propose that the panelists who did speak, as well as anybody else, kind of join now, and perhaps we discuss what are the lessons learned, and what shall we do next time better, and can we recommend this system to similarly situated countries, etc. So maybe David, do you want to start? And Jose, don't go away, because I think you can contribute to that too. Same with everybody else.
Yeah, so we didn't talk about that much that that of all the details, but this was the auction took a year and a day, and so it was a pretty long auction. And Jose's comment about the length and the uncertainty may have discouraged participation, and I think that's definitely the case. Also, I think perhaps the reserve price conditions, that's not unique to the U.S., that sometimes you discourage bidders from even showing up because of the minimum prices. So I think one of the things that happens is, there's sometimes too much focus on the money and not enough focus on the objectives of the process. I'm not saying the money is not important, by the way. That's not at all. It's just they have to balance the financial with the welfare and the policy objectives. That doesn't always happen. So that's my take.
Can I refer to Jose, to whom I would also like to extend our thanks for this excellent presentation and overview and review of what happened and did not happen. So what are the lessons learned for you?
I think I'll speak from a business perspective, not so much the technicals. I think from a business perspective, I think the from a broadcast side, I think they got the spectrum at a very, very low price, which I think was a lot of broadcasters felt that was a political agenda. They want to get their spectrum at a very low price, and they were not willing to sell. So to offset that, you would need a much greater participation in the forward side to bring the proceeds to make it more appealing.
Thank you. Henning, since you raised a question here a few minutes ago, what are your insights from the results?
Yeah, the question that I wonder about is, again, whether this is a one-time thing, which because it was so unique, whether we can actually learn anything significant about that, given that it went low band, there seemed to be dichotomy between stations that for either mission or money reasons were separated into two very diverse camps, very low value and maybe in some cases speculative purchases, which I didn't hear much talked about. I mean, there was a lot of rumors that stations got acquired just to be sold, and that's just not going to reoccur until, and this was my implied question, until the whole carriage regime changes so that the value of getting access to cable is no longer so high. I mean, if we all go to an all IP regime, maybe not.
Thank you very much, Henning. Greg, what is your take?
My take is somewhat similar to David's, which is this can be sped up, but there are a number of ways it can be sped up. One is that if someone does something like this again in the future, in the United States there was a huge effort to treat broadcasters with kid gloves, to make it as simple as possible on the broadcast side, which caused some of these things that Jose said about differentials and the inability for a VHF station to move up, to try to make it simpler on that side, which could be good, but also that their service areas couldn't deviate by more than 1%. They could have had more deviation and compensation for that. But the biggest thing is, run the auction faster, especially on the broadcast side. You could run that in one session all the way down and cut out 6 months out of the auction time, and it would have been much, much faster.
Thank you. Let me take a few more people. Cass Kalba, if you're still on, what's your take? Well, I don't hear him. How about you, Fernando? No comments. And Heather? I don't hear her anymore. Well, so David, yes, Heather.
I'm here. I'm listening. Yes, this was fascinating. I hope the presentations will be posted. There was a lot to absorb, but I guess I am interested in what we learned about how some stations benefited, and I also would like to raise the issue for future discussion about FirstNet, which came up as one of the beneficiaries, and AT&T, as somebody said, was the last carrier standing, and it raises major issues for both the funding from the auctions and the use of spectrum and shared facilities for service to provide nationwide, supposedly, emergency communication, which is quite relevant given California's fires along with other recent natural disasters. So I hope there can be some follow-up on the implications of what happened to the money and the spectrum. Thanks.
So David, you have the last word now.
Well, first I want to thank everybody, both participants and attendees. Secondly, it was pretty complicated. This was a short presentation, only focusing on overall policy objectives and had we, were they met, what could have been best done. There are many other lessons to be learned about implementation, and even though people were concerned that there may not be an incentive auction, another incentive auction, there may be circumstances when they rise again, such as for satellite spectrum. But the individual auctions, both the forward and the reverse, the repacking, there's a lot to learn from them. So I'm sure there's going to be more written, and maybe we'll have another webinar to go over some other details. But thank you very much.
Well, we want to thank David for organizing this, the speakers for participating, Jason for the technical support, Jolie McPhee, who was included the Internet Society in its membership and audience very much. And so I'd like to thank everybody and you, the audience, and I will say goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.